I'm Peter Underwood. I'm the eldest of 6 boys, born in Orford in Suffolk in 1949.
Which suggests, Peter, that you were part of the baby boom which followed the Second World War.
I am indeed a baby boomer. Yeah, my dad came back from the war and married my mum and started this family of 6 boys. We're always being convinced it's 6 boys because she wanted a girl. In many ways, that was an idyllic childhood. Orford is a rather lovely little village on the Suffolk coast with a Norman keep sitting at one end of it and a large shingle spit at the other, which has always been a secret place for the military. We always were free to explore. I mean, one of my childhood memories is getting on my push bike and riding about 3 miles to go and see my friend on a Saturday afternoon. And most of the way with my hands off the handlebars, you know, because I was a 9 or 10-year-old boy, and that's what you do. We went exploring and did what we needed to do or wanted to do.
You were an independent community, obviously.
Well, yeah. We sort of came in threes. The first 3, myself, Doug, who's the next one down, and Steve, were gathered together quite closely in age, about 5 years, I suppose, in total. And then there was another set of 3. Terry, Nigel, and a bit of a gap, and then Adrian. My dad was also of that wartime generation that in 1945 put a Labour government in power, and in 1948 saw the National Health Service come into being. I mean, I'm also one of those early national health babies. Okay, so I went to the local primary school. I was aware in the later years that I was being singled out and shuffled to one side because I was one of the brighter ones. So they'd pick 3 in our year to tutor more intensively for the 11 plus.
Yes.
We were privileged little kids, you see, the 3 of us. We got closer to the fire in the depths of winter, and I mean, you remember strange things, don't you? I mean, the milk freezing in little 1/3 pint bottles and coming out of the top. You know, we all passed actually the 11 plus, and went to what I always describe as a minor public school, if only to wind them up, really. But it was a 2nd division public school called Woodbridge, 12 miles away in the local market town.
The local authority purchased places in
Yeah, they bought a certain number of places, and that decided how many people passed the 11 plus, of course. I still don't know to this day how my parents afforded it. It didn't go with just the uniform. You had to have a winter uniform and a summer uniform, a bloody boater, for God's sake, for the summer, and you had to have the right rugby kit and the right cricket kit. I knew all of my grandparents, and they all lived in the village. My dad's dad was milkman, and I have seen, but I've never been able to find again, a picture of him at the back of a horse and trap with a churn and dippers. And he used to do the village milk round, serving milk from measures out of a milk churn that came direct from the local farm. But I remember my dad's mum, Daisy, but only as a rather stately, large, almost Victorian lady, which I suppose she virtually was, you know, sitting in this little cottage that she had next door to her daughter in a small terrace of cottages in Orford. My other grandparents, my mum's mum and dad, lived next door. We had a pair of council houses on a small estate of them in Orford. Yeah, so my grandmother had been in service. That was a thing with village girls and of her era. My earliest memory is 1953, the East Coast floods. And my grandfather, my mother's dad, was a coalman. He was tiny, he was 5 foot nothing, but he used to hump 100-weight bags of coal around the place. His coal lorry was down by the quay at Orford, down by where the river was. And he went down, or took me down, as the floods were subsiding. And I can recall, the thing I can recall is being in my pushchair, and the water coming over the wheels as we went down the road to check his lorry was okay. He played a big role in my life in many ways. Because there were so many kids, he was the one, and we're talking primary school age really, who'd take me off, and when he used to do various gardening jobs. Do you remember Fison's fertilisers?
I do remember that, yeah.
Lady Fison lived in the village, okay, had a big house and all the rest of it, and Gramp did her garden. One of these green-fingered people. And come the annual village flower show, she'd enter various bits from her garden, and she, of course, would collect the prizes. But everybody knew Gramp had actually grown the damn thing, so they'd stand there and say, yeah.
Yes. Well done, Lady Fashion.
Yeah. When we got dirty, he always wore a cap. And if we were a bit grubby and he had to take us back to Mother, he'd take his cap off and spit on it and then rub our faces with it. For a lot of people of that boomer generation, if you have parents who'd been through that and through the war, they really focused on their kids and they wanted their kids to have more than they had. So food was always a priority, you know. If you've been through rationing, then, I mean, my mother was a feeder, you know, and all of us, we had massive meals and were expected to eat them as well. Just on the other side of the water was Orford Ness, which in my childhood was the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment. They used Orford Ness as a testing ground, and it had been used as a testing ground for decades before that, because it's a shingle spit. So the River Orr runs on the village side of it and the North Sea on the other side. And it goes up to a very narrow point at Aldborough at the other end. It's 10 miles long. So they fenced off the middle bit. And what they were doing was making sure that the bombs that were to be dropped by the V-bomber fleets didn't go off whilst they were still on the ground or in the V-bombers. So they took them and they froze them and they heated them. And they shook them and did all sorts of things to them. And they did it inside a curious set of buildings, which still exist on Orford Ness and are now looked after by the National Trust. But some have very thick walls and very thin roofs, so that if anything goes bang, it goes upwards and doesn't destroy the nearby village. And others have very thin walls and very thick roofs, so it, in theory, comes down and smothers it if anything goes wrong. Well, my dad worked there. I mean, that was where he finally found his first well-paid job, because when I was a kid, he worked 3, 4, 5 jobs. He was a farm worker. He was a part-time fireman, retained fireman. He used to do a lot of painting and decorating for the big houses in the village. All sorts of bits and pieces like that, because if you've got that number of children, they're not cheap. Because he did all that working, he did all those jobs, I didn't really see a lot of him. You know, I mean, there are pictures of picnics and things like that. We went out as a family, but most of the time, when I was at primary school and indeed at secondary school, he was flat out, and by the time I was at Woodbridge School, I was flat out. By the time I was 16 or 17, I'd made friends with some of these middle class pupils, best friends with some of them, and particularly the ones that had a London address. And by the time I was 16, I was at the Marquee Club in Soho, and watching some really amazing bands, you know. So yeah, and I'd also by that stage joined CND and went on a couple of those marches. I became political at that age, joined the Labour Party. Took part in the American Embassy, or a couple of American Embassy demos, which was all part of the scene, man. You know, if you were, I mean, bear in mind Woodbridge is only an hour on the train from London. That was magical, to be honest.
And these friends recruited from your
from school.
Small public school, minor public school, your second division public school. And so clearly, despite their privileged background.
I've never wanted, because people who have privilege tend to discriminate against those who don't. It doesn't mean that those who don't have to discriminate against those who do. I don't believe in discriminating against anyone. I judge everybody on their actions, really. And they were the people I chose to mix with. They were good mates. Yeah. My lower sixth year, when I was 17, I did absolutely nothing except party. I really did absolutely nothing. I went to a lot of my friends' parties. I spent a lot of time in London. I went to a lot of music gigs.
What was imbibed at these parties?
Oh, depends on the party, but the ones where as middle class parents do, they'll sometimes sort of just go away and let their kids take over. And some of those were pretty wild, yeah. I did a fair bit of cannabis when I was that age. I wasn't very fond of uppers and downers, and LSD scared me a bit, mostly because I quite value my brain, and I don't have I'm just cowardice perhaps, I don't know. But yeah, I did a fair amount of weed. I never got caught, and a lot of alcohol. Yes, I indulged myself for that first year, and then decided I probably ought to do a bit of work, and came out with some decent A-levels. I was offered three university places. So I decided I wanted to write, and to me the obvious way of doing that was becoming a journalist. I went to the East Anglian Daily Times junior reporter, and I was really lucky. I went, oddly enough, to Woodbridge, the local office. There was this lean-to at the back, and you went up a set of stairs, wooden stairs, and it was something I can only describe as a garret. It had a sloping roof, and it was about 8 foot wide and about 12 foot long. And in this space there were two of us, me and a guy called Jack Leithley, who was my boss. He was the editor of the Woodbridge Reporter, and he had his filing system was to pile up newspapers. So this space was even smaller because every wall from floor to ceiling was covered in back issues of the Woodbridge Reporter on both sides. And Jack used to sit over a little portable typewriter at one end, and he must have been, when I was 18, he would have been 50, I suppose, that sort of age. And he'd sit over this portable typewriter, hammering it with two fingers, with a fag in his mouth. And I used to watch him, and he would be like this. And you could see the ash on the fag getting longer and longer. And eventually, of course, it dropped into his keyboard. And about every fourth fag, he'd suddenly notice the ash on the keys, and he'd go, and the entire place would fill with fag ash. But Jack was brilliant. He taught me so much. He made me understand that it wasn't about stories, it was about people. And if you knew people and you knew enough people and you were friends with those people, then you could almost always find the stories that you needed. I was around when Snape Malting's concert hall burned down. This was Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears' place. And it's only 5 miles away from where I lived, and it happened at a weekend. And I was working on that for nearly 48 hours flat out. And my dad was one of the firemen actually on the job. And to this day I can picture Benjamin Britten coming into the hall after it had all been damped down by the firemen. It was just charred ashes and the stage was there. And on the stage was the Peter Pears' grand piano, or what was left of it. And he was just standing over this grand piano in a flood of tears.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that.
Yeah. I had a case of two older ladies in a Mini had driven under the back of an articulated lorry. I was peering in and
that would have been traumatic.
The copper came up to your sergeant and put his arms around my shoulder and said, "So you all right, lad?" I said, "Yeah, I suppose." And he said, "Look, not your family, are they?" I said, No, I don't know." I said, "Well, in that case, they're not your problem, are they?" "Yeah, all right." And you get a mindset, David.
Yeah.
And you have to have that mindset doing that job. Anyway, I went from Woodbridge, learning my trade, and next stop was Hadley, the village on the other side of Ipswich, where I moved away from home, really. And that's where I first came across the craze. They bought a house, a little village just outside Hadley, and then they'd bought Vi, their mother, a cottage in the same village, and they were moving her in. And so the press pack was down from London, and this was my patch, so I had to be there. I was in this pack around the garden gate, front garden gate, saying, "Oh, Mr. Crane, Mr. Crane," And Ronnie, I think, was coming back and leaned into my face because I was at the front, being young and enthusiastic. And he was about 6 inches away from me and said, "Son." And after that I went to Bury St Edmunds, another East Anglian Daily Times office. I became very much a Crown Court reporter there because it was Bury St Edmunds had a Crown Court, so all the big court cases would go there. I used to spend my days listening to court cases, making notes, writing the story in my head, never on paper, hitting the phone, talking to the copy taker at Ipswich and dictating what was often the front page story straight out of here, which was a very valuable skill to acquire. I wanted the smoke, I wanted the big, so I got a job with the Stratford Express in the East End of London, and I was mostly doing crime reporting and covering the actual East End. My patch was sort of Bow, Bethnal Green, Limehouse, Isle of Dogs, Whitechapel, all that bit. And what I was mostly covering was crime. So I spent a lot of time in greasy little dives and police stations, and there's not a lot of difference between the two.
All of those being quite deprived areas, of course.
Very, yeah. It was the one place where I would talk to you about standing to one side, and it's not my problem. Every now and again that doesn't work. And I came across an Irish family in a squat, lots of young children, and they'd been forced out by thugs working for the property owner. And I did actually not only write the story, but actually help them, or tried to help them find another squat to move into where they could get the kids into school and get some proper help and all the rest of it. So sometimes you have to get involved.
So investigative reporters become welfare officers
Well, you
in
do,
their
yeah,
spare time.
because you're dealing with people's tragedies
Yeah.
in many ways, and you come across them. I went, and sometimes it's funny. I went to there was a tenement block in the East End, knocked on one door, and this lady, must have been 60, comes to the door, and all she's wearing is a body stocking. Well, one of the line, nothing else, just a body stocking. So you gulp. And, oh, come in, dear. She says, come in. And you look around and have a seat. And you're, is there anything I can sit on that I can still wear the trousers afterwards? Would you like a cup of tea? You know. And you have to say yes. You can't say no, because that would be rude, and that's not why you're there. And the East End people don't like the police. While I was down there was a war going on for the crazed turf between 2 or 3 gangs, you know. And I distinctly remember one occasion where one gang member had his bits shot off by another gang member with a sawed-off shotgun. I was watching or following the police as they went around this really busy market, talking to the stall holders and the customers. And you know, this had happened in the middle of the day, in the middle of a busy market. And every person they asked, did you see anything? No. Well, you must have heard something. No, I was busy doing no. And we used to make enough money out of selling stories to the London evenings and the nationals, because the East End is a wonderful patch for news, you know. And we'd be, in those days, we'd physically take it down to Fleet Street. And when we'd made a lot of money, we would go to the kosher restaurant in Whitechapel. There was always a kosher rabbi around the place, and because Mike was Jewish, and he had the nasty habit of ordering a bacon sandwich, which he felt entitled to do as he was Jewish, but he did it just as the kosher rabbi was walking past the table on an occasion. I was then subjected to a 30-minute lecture by this rabbi. So, I'm not Jewish, don't talk to me. Then I met Heather in the Samson and Hercules ballroom in Norwich. So she'd come from Kings Lynn Way and I'd come up from Suffolk, and yeah, it was almost a sort of love at first sight thing. And we were married 18 months later, I suppose, a couple of years later. I suppose that was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Without her, I wouldn't have been able to do many of the things that I've done over the years, and we've had 3 really wonderful children. They've all turned out to be excellent individuals, and I think we're both a bit proud of that, and some lovely grandchildren as well. So that is a theme that runs through everything that I did from that point onwards, and Heather has tolerated all of my silly ideas and fancies, and allowed me to be whatever I wanted to be. I left London and moved up to Northamptonshire, which was a bit tame. I mean, nothing really noticeable in terms of stories, except I got threatened by the IRA on one occasion. But, yeah, I've always enjoyed sticking my nose where it's not wanted, and sometimes there's a sort of price for that. You know, you do worry. Don't get me wrong. I have dragged my family around the country, and it's only really, and I must say this, and I keep saying it, I could not have done what I've done without the total and utter support of Heather, because she's always been the one who's carried the brunt of my whims and fancies. I was then offered a job with Anglia Television, and that was, well, yes, and it was very well paid. And I was a sort of sub-editor, occasional reporter. But I got bored, which is why I, at one point, held 5 different trade union jobs and another 6 different Labour Party jobs. Because television news is a bit of a vampire. It feeds off newspapers and proper journalists, and doesn't do anything much else. So I did my job when I wasn't being father of the chapel for the National Union of Journalists, or negotiating wages for the whole of ITV's journalists, or standing for the Labour Party in the council seat, or being a member of a Quango, would you believe, the East Anglian Economic Development Council. And then eventually, even though I had to take a salary cut, I've got to go back to newspapers and proper journalism. So I found a job with South Wales Echo, Western Mail and Echo, in Cardiff, and we moved down there, and I had the time of my life down there, because I was writing leading articles in the morning. So my morning job was to come into the office, having listened to Radio 4 and then read the newspapers, and go into the editor and decide what part of the world we were going to set right that morning. He knew I was left-wing when he employed me. There's a degree of arrogance that goes with that, I suppose. Yeah, I have to blame public school for that. Well, it breeds arrogance, you know it does.
You did derive some benefit from
arrogance, yeah. I mean, it's been a major asset as I've gone through, I do agree. That was one bit of the ethos that I sort of soaked up, and that's the bit that made me able to be a journalist, I suspect, in some ways. So you know then that you're as good as anybody else. So when you're there and interviewing Margaret Thatcher, Arthur Scargill, Neil Kinnock, Harold Wilson, Ted Heath, any of them, the attitude isn't fall-up tugging, I don't do that. The attitude is, I'm as good as you are, pal. So, when I wasn't pontificating, I used to go digging dirt, really. There was a scam going on with cancerous cows and farm animals, and these people were picking them up before they finally died, and the farmer well knew not only that they'd had cancer or whatever, but they were probably pumped full of antibiotics, and rather than taking them to the knackers, was taking them to a abattoir. So they were entering the human food chain. So my detective chief inspector, who was a greengrocer, fed me into the Freemasons of South Wales, and put me in touch with a 33rd degree Freemason who was disaffected with his fellow Masons and willing to talk, willing to loan me all of his books of ritual right up to the 33rd degree, willing to pass me every year the full lodge lists for the whole of Wales. And so we consequently published a whole series of feature articles about this ritual and that ritual, these lodges, the list of the police lodges in Cardiff and the legal lodges in Cardiff and the crossovers between them, of course. So as a result of working in Cardiff, I got headhunted by a public relations company because they wanted the contract for Cardiff Bay, which was being developed at that time. So I switched and then went into crisis PR work, which is looking after companies when they've done something silly, is the way I tend to describe it. So I spent the next few years chasing around, almost always in the early hours of a Sunday morning, to various chemical and industrial plants where things had gone badly wrong and had affected their neighbours. basically holding the hands of chemical engineers and people like that and saying, there, it'll be all right. I took my bit of it. Partnerships rarely work long term. I thought I was doing more than my fair share. So I took my bit of it and went up to Lancashire and worked from there for the next few years. I hit 50 and I'm chasing all over the country doing what I'm doing, and had a heart attack, which was interesting. Had a bypass, and about nearly a year later, okay then, but by that stage I decided that I didn't want to work 15, 16, 17 hour days, but we decided that we'd go to Spain, live in Spain for foreseeable. And we went over there and I did some freelancing there for the local English language stuff and feeding stuff back. So anyway, we were out in Spain for about a year doing this, and then my youngest partner, then wife now, had a baby, had severe postnatal depression, needed some help. So we came back. I knew people on The Guardian in Manchester, and I did a lot of work for their weeklies and various other things like that. I did some subbing for the Daily Express in Preston, where they've got a remote site. And we moved onto a boat, because that was simpler than buying a house. And we knew boats, so over the next 17 years we lived on a boat in various places. Started off up in Lancashire, on the Macclesfield is where we started, and moved around from one base to another, and I'd do a year, 6 months work with somebody and go and do something else. But we made enough money, and the boat is the ultimate expression really, if you've got that lump of money to start with, of the philosophy of you can live on much less. Yeah. Because you're not paying rates and rents, you're paying a licence fee and that's about it.
Mooring charges?
Yeah, if you moor, but for a large part of that time we were what's called continuously cruised. We would winter probably somewhere like Stafford, or around Stafford, moving, because you've got canals either side of Stafford really. April, May, we'd head south, probably do Rickmansworth Festival on the way, and several others where you get very drunk with a lot of people you only meet once a year. We travelled a lot for several years, and then Heather's health got worse, mine got a bit worse. I was at one stage falling over, so we meandered back to Norbury, and they found us a mooring in the arm of the old Shrewsbury and Newport Canal. We recognised we were getting to the point where we can't physically do it anymore. So we started looking and came up with this place just towards the end of COVID. My daughter keeps threatening me with a religious funeral, knowing it's the one thing that would wind me up completely. Hence my warning to anybody who comes across me that I'm a socialist, atheist, Republican.